Hi, everybody. Today we are going to talk about revising the dialogue in your fiction story that you've written. So the first thing we're going to talk about when it comes to revising this dialogue is how to properly use punctuation in dialogue. There are a lot of punctuation rules when it comes to dialogue. We're going to just cover 5 of them, 5 sort of basic punctuation rules, and then we want you to try to go back to your dialogue and make sure that you're following these rules. Some of them are probably pretty familiar to you, and then some of them might be new. So rule number 1 is that when we start our quote, you want to start with a capital letter. So you can see in these 2 examples that when I began the quote part of my sentence, I started with a capital. So this is most important in the first example because I do have a capital for Jimmy because that's the beginning of my sentence. Jimmy shouted, but then I need another capital when I start saying the sentence that Jimmy shouted. So I capitalize that S for see you at the game. Sometimes we forget to do that because we think, well, it's not the beginning of a sentence, but it is the beginning of the quote. So you want to capitalize the beginning of the quote. In my second example, I do also capitalize the beginning of my quote. It's also the beginning of my sentence, so hopefully I would remember to capitalize that anyway. But you'll notice that then when I write asked Cindy, that does not need to be capitalized because that is not part of the quote. I'm just continuing my sentence. So rule number 1, when I start the quote, it should start with a capital letter. Rule number 2, when a quotation is interrupted into 2 parts, and I'll show you in my examples what I mean by that, the second part is going to begin with a lowercase letter. So let's look at this first example. What are some of the things Mrs. Baskin inquired that make school so much fun? So this is called an interrupted quote because I have the beginning part, what are some of the things? Then I stop the quote in order to tell you who's talking, in this case, Mrs. Baskin, and then I continue the quote by that same person. Because this quote is being continued by the same person, I am not going to capitalize it. I'm going to use a lowercase letter here. In my second example, Sarah says, "One thing I like," replied Sarah. Then she continues talking with "is recess." So you'll notice that the is not capitalized because it's a continuation of the first part of the quote. Another tip is that if you choose to do this type of dialogue, you want to do a comma after the interruption. So you'll notice in blue, I've highlighted where I've used a comma. So Mrs. Baskin inquired, comma, and then I continue my quote, or replied Sarah, comma, and then I continue my quote. Rule number 3, and this one can be a little bit tricky. Do not put a period at the end of a quotation if it's followed by a dialogue tag. And a dialogue tag is like, she whispered, Becky replied, Paul yelled. If you have that after your dialogue, you do not want to use a period at the end of your quotation. You might use a comma, a question mark, or an exclamation mark, but not a period. Periods go after the dialogue tag to end the sentence. So I'm going to show you some examples of what this actually means. So in my first sentence, you'll notice this is an exclamation point dialogue because Paul is yelling. So in this case, I have my algebra class is driving me crazy, and I'm going to put the exclamation point there. Then I'm going to end the quote, write Paul yelled, and then I'm going to put the period. So in that case, I have an exclamation mark to end my dialogue and then a period to end my sentence. Now, in the next example where Becky is talking, that's my favorite class, Becky replied. That's just a sentence. It's not a question. It's not an exclamation. But I know the rule says not to put a period there. The period only comes at the end of the sentence. So you can see highlighted in red that instead I used a comma. So when you feel like you want to use a period, but you know that your sentence is going to continue with something like Becky replied, you're going to put a comma, and then you're going to put the period all the way at the end. In my third example, I'm asking a question. So in this case, it's where are you going? So I can use that question mark. I'm going to put it at the end of the dialogue. Where are you going? Question mark. And then I'm going to put the period at the end of the sentence after she whispered. Now I included this fourth example to show you the one situation where you would have the period as part of the dialogue, and that would be if it truly is the end of your sentence. So in this case, because my dialogue tag is in the beginning, she looked around and said, I'm not going in there, and that's the end of my sentence, I have nothing left to say, I would use a period. So we're not using periods if there is a dialogue tag that comes after the dialogue. You can use commas, you can use question marks, you can use exclamation marks, but periods are only used at the true end of your sentence. Rule number 4, whatever punctuation mark you are using, make sure it comes inside the quotation marks. So whether it's a comma, a question mark, a period, an exclamation point, whatever it is, you want to make sure it comes before your quotation mark. Sometimes we think it's supposed to come after the quotation marks, but it actually should come before. So you can see highlighted in red some examples of different types of punctuation, and each time I put it inside the quotation mark. And then rule number 5, we've definitely talked about before, but it can be very easy to forget, is that every time a different person is speaking, you want to start a new paragraph by indenting. And that can mean that if you are writing a conversation between two people and it's going back and forth pretty frequently, you might have a lot of paragraphs, and that's okay. That's how we as a writer show that different people are speaking. It really helps the reader when they see that indent because they know that now a new person is talking. So in this example, it's a conversation between Kevin and Susie, and you can see that each time a different person speaks, I've indented to show that it's a new paragraph, and that gives my reader the indication that a new person is talking. So just 2 more reminders. Always make it clear who's speaking in the dialogue. Sometimes when we're writing, and if we are writing a lot of dialogue, we can start leaving off dialogue tags like he said, she said, Susie said, Mrs. DeCurtis whispered. We can leave those off, and then it can be confusing to know who's talking. You always want your reader to know who's talking. We're also going to talk next about trying to avoid using the word said repeatedly. Said is definitely our go-to dialogue tag, but there are a lot of other words that we can use that are more creative and more descriptive. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so now we're going to talk about dialogue tags. I've mentioned dialogue tags a bunch in this slideshow, but we're actually going to break down what they are, what their purpose is, and then how we can be as descriptive as possible with them. So a dialogue tag is a short phrase that is before, after, or in between a quotation. So we have 3 examples here that show it coming before, in the middle, and at the end. So you can see in the first sentence, the Jose asked, that is a dialogue tag, and then I have the quote. The explained Emily in the second sentence, which you can see is interrupting the quote. We learned about that a little bit in the beginning of the slideshow. Explained Emily is the dialogue tag there. And in the last one, suggested Carly is the dialogue tag at the end. So those are some examples of what I mean when I refer to a dialogue tag. They have 2 main purposes in a story. One is they tell the reader who is speaking. So for example, if you're writing about 3 people and they're at a beach and they're all talking, you have to include dialogue tags, otherwise the reader is unsure which of the 3 people is saying what, and it's usually really important to know which character is saying what words. They also show the reader some actions that are going along with the words. So for example, if the 3 people that are speaking are sharing a secret, you might use the dialogue tag whispered instead of talking. So these tags can be really helpful to get the reader to picture what's going on in their mind and get them to really understand the way in which the words are being said and the way in which you're intending the words to be said. He said and she said may be all that your story technically needs, but there are lots of other ways to write he said and she said that can add a lot of variety to your story. Okay, so these are some dialogue tags in this document you'll have access to, so you'll be able to see them. There's a lot, and you obviously will not use all of them, but they're a really good list to look at and to really ask yourself when you're writing if any of these are more appropriate than just saying the word said. So when you're going back and revising your dialogue, definitely use this list and ask yourself if one of these words might be more appropriate or more descriptive than said. Okay, so today for independent work, you're going to use what you learned during this video to revise the dialogue in your story. So you're going to go back to your story and you're going to revise the dialogue that you wrote. You want to focus on using dialogue punctuation correctly, so using those 5 big rules that we talked about. And you want to focus on making those dialogue tags as specific as possible. There are going to be 2 charts you're going to have access to. One is that dialogue tag chart that I just showed you, and one is a chart called Dialogue Rules, which just summarizes the 5 rules that we talked about today. So I would suggest having those up or having those printed so you can look at them while you are revising your writing. I think that would be a really successful way to do it. Good luck!